Yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Dave Potes. I'm the technical manager for Notting Hill Genesis. But for a little while now, I've been kind of co-chairing this development group with Paul White from Gravesham, who I'm assuming Paul's on the call somewhere. Some of the
Indeed.
key players, and there's lots of people on the call, so we're certainly not going to go through any introductions, but obviously the key players that we've got in the room from BIM4Housing are George, who I assume most people will know of, and Richard. Richard and I have been kind of working together to kind of pull the agenda for today together. Um, so just so everyone's aware, I think Giz will be recording today. We tend to record these sessions so that we can put notes together afterwards. No, don't want anyone to be intimidated by that or threatened by that. You know, there's no. This is a very safe environment for us to kind of share some thoughts and share ideas. And that's very much the kind of tone of today. You know, my role here as chair is really to just get as many people participating as we possibly can, and kind of sharing your thoughts. Just by way of background, within the last couple of months, there have been workshops um, held with various groups, and there's a whole load of information and thinking that's kind of coming out of those groups. Um, but on reflection, there's not been a lot of conversation. There's lots of conversation about what needs to happen, not hugely a lot of conversation about how and how we actually go about making things happen. And a couple of the topics that came out of recent conversations, the first one seems to suggest that it would be a great idea to get specialist designers involved much earlier in the design process. And we can talk about that a little bit more. But also to what extent we can involve kind of manufacturers and specialists in the kind of quality assurance process once things are installed. So that just those kind of topics gave us some subject matter, if you like, that we thought there would be worthy of some conversation. Um, Particularly as from a client and I guess from a developer point of view, one of the discussions that's certainly going on within our organization is how does all of this impact upon our procurement thinking? Um, from our point of view, typically we're a single stage design and build client. That's our preferred approach. And certainly a lot of consultants are starting to suggest to us that might not be the best way to move forwards. Um, so, uh, okay, there's lots of hands still up in the air. If you don't have anything to say, then take your hands down. Otherwise, you might get singled out. Um, okay. I mean, with that in mind, if you do want to say anything, then please raise your hands, and I'll drag you into the conversation. Um, but as I say, one of the debates that we're having is around procurement. We're getting lots of advice. We were particularly interested in whether we had manufacturers or contractors as part of this group, because it's all very well looking at this from a client perspective, but actually the concept of getting specialists involved earlier in the process, you know, at one, how do we do that? You know, what is the best way to be engaging those specialists, and what are the issues that creates? I guess commercially, I guess from a risk point of view, from a resource point of view, etc., etc. Um, just before we get into that, though, this all that the whole need to involve specialists earlier seems to predicate itself on a suggestion that the amount of detail that's needed at Gateway 2 in order to satisfy building control is far more detailed than it ever was. Um, George and I had a conversation about this the other day, and it's fair to say that we're probably at either end of the spectrum. So at one end, you've got, we just need to provide enough information to be able to evidence that we're building control compliant or building regs compliant. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got kind of full specification information that evidences, you know, how systems are intended to perform, even at that gateway 2 stage. So I was interested in, George rather kindly dragged Adam into the conversation, who's now going to smile because he knows what's coming now. So I thought we'd kick off the procurement conversation just with a sense of what views do we have around the room about what our anticipation is, or what our expectation is for the detail at Gateway 2. My own view is at the moment it remains ambiguous. So there are no right or wrong answers, but I'm just really interested in what information people have, what thoughts people have. So over to the group just to share your thoughts. And Adam, you can start if you like.
Could I just jump in before Adam, because I think there's a context in this that we've been talking about for several months now, and that to some extent it's been led by Paul McSolly from Mace and Paul White, the damper specialist on this, the M&E specialist, because part of the challenge, I think, is that the way procurement is currently done is that at Gateway 2, or the end of detailed design, when construction starts, where people are starting to put partitioning up, so things are, you know, well on, the M&E contractor may then just be appointed. They look at the M&E design, and then they'll make changes, either for coordination purposes or for practicality purposes, or indeed for product selection. And the net impact of that, as I understand it from talking to the community, is that we end up with builders' work holes being in the wrong place, and therefore the compartmentation is compromised. So additional work is needed, then unnecessary work perhaps, to try and make good something that should have been sorted out beforehand. And what Paul McSolly's position has been is that work should have been done by the M&E contractors being engaged during detailed design to address those particular areas. Now, there's probably other specialists that are involved too late as well, but certainly the M&E one, I think, is one that it's easy for me to understand. And I have to say that I thought from the discussions that we've had in terms of the construction control plan and the need for products to be selected before construction starts, I was quite encouraged that we were on the right track with that. But I have to say that, you know, I was interested in Adam's comments of the last week or so, because I'm feeling as well that there seems to be a rolling back of that.
Yeah,
Adam.
Thanks, George. I haven't been to one of these in a while, so I don't think I know many or any of you. Tend to keep my head down and you know, like all good technically minded introverted people, try not to talk to people too often, but so sometimes stick my head above the parapet, and the recent occasion is the one that George is referencing. So I'll try my best to not repeat what the regulator said, and some of you might have been on the call, but to give, I suppose, my take on the regulator's apparent change in stance over the last few weeks or months. So I attended this and other similar meetings over the last, you know, months and years, and as George was speaking about then. I think the conversation's very much been on, look, the bar's going to be very high at Gateway 2. There's going to be an expectation that there's a lot of detail up front. And then, you know, you've got this situation where your designers have designed and your builders build, to put it in a very simple way. And that's a very nice and clean thing. And obviously everything we do in the construction industry is nice and clean and simple like that. So why wouldn't that work? So that was, I think that was the kind of prevailing message from the regulator. It was design and then build. And I think that's what most, you know, working groups like this have been focused on for a number of months, if not years now. And then as recently, it was the 10th of January, the regulator held one of their webinar sessions that they've been doing for about the last 2 months or so, I think, and they're topic based. And they're doing them basically chronologically, from what I can tell. It's kind of, they started with one on planning Gateway 1, which I thought we were all more or less familiar and comfortable with and had experience of by now. And then they've worked on through some other topics. The most recent one on the 10th of January was, I can't quite remember how it was titled, but it was about Gateway 2 and kind of how an applicant and a project team would work with the regulator to get that initial approval, and then during the construction phase on site. And through that meeting, there was a bit of a presentation, then there was a Q&A, and one of the questions was, you know, what's your expectation, dear regulator, what's your expectation at Gateway 2 as far as design development is concerned? And I'll admit, I think I probably rolled my eyes when that question came up on screen, because I thought, well, we've done that to death and we all know that, so why are we wasting time dwelling on it? And then I had to kind of eat my words or unroll my eyes, because actually the regulator's response was, again, paraphrasing, please go and watch it back for yourselves, don't rely on me by any stretch of the imagination, but it was in the majority of cases, a REBA 3 level of design would be acceptable if it sets out the parameters for how the design, for how the built asset will achieve compliance with the building regulations. So as long as you've said, here's the box or the gap, and the design, the subsequent design is going to happen within these 2 goalposts, we'll be happy with that. There will be, you know, conditions or requirements as they're known in the regulations, but that was the message. And all of the speakers on the call agreed with that position and said that that was likely to be how things would play out going forward. So that struck me as a change in messaging, and it played on my mind for a little bit. And then I watched the recording back 3 or 4 times and made sure I wrote it down word for word. I can't repeat it to you on the call and it would bore you to death, but that was the paraphrased version of it. And yeah, spoke to a number of colleagues in our business and a number of our suppliers and people in the supply chain, and most of them just kind of either laughed or kind of shook their head or thought I was talking nonsense. So yeah, we're working through that now. We're trying to understand what that means. I don't think it should necessarily change our approach, because I don't think it's a sensible thing to do, given, you know, the risk of change once you've got into contract with a builder, with a construction partner, and you're off building the thing. I don't think you want the risk of lots of hooks left in a approval, these requirements, these conditions on your approval. But it certainly seems that the regulator is happy to accept less design than we had all been anticipating. Hopefully that was a reasonable enough summary. I think I was maybe a bit more articulate and brief in my LinkedIn post about it, but yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of a summary.
No, Adam, that's really helpful. I didn't go to that particular webinar, but I'd been to HSE webinars pre-Christmas when they were being asked similar questions. And certainly what they were saying at that time was consistent with what you've heard. There seemed to be a suggestion that the level of detail that people were expecting to have to give didn't seem to be being reinforced in the message that was coming from the regulator. And it's interesting because the conversation that George and I had, I was coming from a place that said we simply need to provide enough information at Gateway 2 to be able to evidence that what's being designed and constructed will meet building regulations. You don't need to go any further than that at that stage. So the suggestion that you've got to start to specify individual components certainly wasn't at the forefront of our minds. But then there's a big however, because I've spoken to George several times about the issue about the fire dampers, and the Paul from Mace. He's got lots of experience of inspecting fire dampers that have been put into buildings, that they simply can't access them to maintain them because they've almost been put in as an afterthought, and kind of squeezed a pint into a quart pot. So just because the regulator doesn't need that level of detail for building control, that doesn't necessarily mean, as you suggest, that if we're going to move forwards and deliver better quality, that it's still not the right thing to do. But again, we're in this situation of ambiguity, where some people will and some people won't. Has anyone else on the call got any comments on what Adam said or got an opinion? Jim, you're on mute, Jim. I mean, some people like it that way, but no, I suggest you come off mute.
Again, I reiterate, I've always got an opinion, but yeah, because I'm particularly interested in products where details are not actually considered until almost the premises is ready to be occupied. Very little thought goes in to it at design stage.
Yeah.
There's this little thing at the moment for HRRBs called wayfinding that is not clearly defined, other than in the mind of those that wrote the paragraphs. I'm continually at the moment being sent plans or safety strategy plans to say, please list wayfinding signs as required by building regulations. And it's too late. It's literally too late in the process if it hasn't been considered at design stage, because this is fire and rescue deployment stuff. And there's a huge amount of work because it's all bespoke. It's not straight product off the shelf. The siting of these products needs to be absolutely correct. Otherwise, the fire and rescue get wayfinding to all sorts of different parts of the building.
Yeah.
But that work is expected to be done free and for gratis by those tendering for the last pieces of M&E work. And of course, illumination of these components or arrangements is absolutely key. So there's a huge amount of consultation to be taken. And sorry to take a bit of time on the illustration, but this is where I feel it always falls down on dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And with all due respect to you, Adam, I know how you feel, because we're expected on our desk at the very last minute to be shoved a drawer in and make head and tail of some 2 paragraphs that, with all due respect to tier 1 or a subcontractor, has sent, oh, can you tell us what we need and price it up, please? And so that's the reality of it. So I don't know whether that helps in the conversation, but that's my problem.
I think it's another good example, Jim, of design considerations that get left too late. So yeah, no, it's definitely on message. Ian, Ian McIlroy.
I can't pronounce it either, David. Don't worry.
Good man.
I don't think it's any surprise that the building safety regulators fallen back on specified process, not just products, in order to prove compliance. Because I think that came out of the first webinar actually, where there was a lot of ambiguity around it, and a big pushback from the REBA contingent when they said everything completed at stage 4. I think the onus then falls back on us as a supply chain to work out, well, what does that mean and what is sufficient process? Because if you refer back to the plan of works, it refers to a design responsibility matrix. Still never really seen one that actually manages design responsibility. And I think that's where our opportunity is to push back and say that these are the documents we need. When we talk about early supply chain involvement, we have to be really precise about which packages and when. We now talk about super systems. So for us, it's interior system. Yeah, that sits alongside engineering services. And we've subdivided that into floors and staircases, walls and ceilings, and finishing, fire stopping and finishing. Because again, we seem to be surprised there's doors in walls, but they're two different packages. They're not talking to each other. Then all of a sudden we've got difficult details. I mean, this morning, my first call this morning was about an interior partition into a mullion with a composite interface detail that nobody's got any test evidence for. What stage is the project at? We're just building the 10th. We're building the 10th floor out now.
Wow.
So yeah, that's way too late, because you know, and that conversation actually only came out because the contract had been reviewed, and there was an assumption all the way through that that detail was going to be covered by the specialist subcontractor's insurance, and the specialist subcontractors said, well, that detail can't live on my insurance, right? I'm not insured for that.
Yeah.
The manufacturers would recommend it as a caveated detail to the principal designer. The principal designers then said, well, I can't cover it, stick it in a specialist package. Yeah, and there's only really three options with that now. One is that the detail gets assessed. Well, the first option should have been a redesign to allow for a detail that was in scope. Now we're at the point of assessing or testing that detail, which is going to cost somebody an awful lot of money, and we're at the point of worrying about who when we're building out the 10th floor. Yeah, that's the stuff that we've got to get better. So I think there's a point at which you say, okay, pragmatically, we need to be clear about what completed stage 4 actually means. If we're talking about stage 4 design completed, and then where it's not completed stage 4 design, the design responsibility matrix needs to determine the process by which that's going to be abdicated. And then the competence of anybody who's bidding for that work needs to be properly assessed against their ability to deliver that. And they're the kind of processes we need now scribed, because otherwise, yeah, it's just going to be chaos out there.
That's really helpful, Ian. Thank you. George, you had your hand up next, but I'm going to ignore you because you've already spoken. So I'm going to go to Edward next, if that's okay.
Okay.
Apologies, George. Sorry if I'm sounding a bit Tom Waits, but I've got a bit of a end of a cold. But yeah, what struck me, I'm thinking about the end of the process where we're going to occupation. I'm involved more with creating safety cases and safety case reports, and of course we are going to write a bit of our safety case on the basis that the building had robust controls around design and construction. So any changes to that, what we saw was coming through as a really robust, strong regulatory system, potentially starts to undermine our safety case. And in some instances, we might end up in the impasse where we say, we can't write a credible safety case for this building because actually the process has been a bit too fluid, because the regulator hasn't been strong enough. And this is quite simple as that. If we're not allowing adequate time for design to unfold and all the parties to work to produce a safe product, you know, that's part of our safety case gone, because we're saying basically this building is safe because it was designed and constructed, the product is safe, and then we're managing it safely. If we start to lose part of that, we're in a difficult position at the end when we're going to the operational phase.
Okay, no, that's an interesting perspective. We might come back to that. Thank you, Edward. George, go on. I can't hold you back.
No, I was just going to build on what you said earlier with regard to what Paul McSolly was talking about in terms of, let's say, a damper.
Yeah.
And although you're absolutely right, one of the challenges is whether you've got adequate access to be able to do it. But the other point that Paul McSolly's been making was it the right damper?
Yeah.
Was it the right product for that particular circumstance?
Yeah.
Because often if the product is picked without due consideration of where it's going and what system it's going to be part of, then it could well be a very good product, but it's the wrong one for that particular location.
Yeah.
And he says that he's seeing it time and time again, that the products, because they're being picked too late in the process, or they're not being picked in the right context, then that's part of the issue. Anyway.
And it's interesting, isn't it? So if that's not going to get picked up at Gateway 2 as part of a building control process, then how does that issue come to light? You know, where's the governance that does that piece of quality assurance that says, actually, do you know what, we've got this wrong.
Well,
we've chosen the wrong, or we can't put the product in that we want to put in because we don't have the space.
Could I just jump in there? That's an interesting point that you've just made there, because I'm nowhere near as knowledgeable as most of the people on this call about things like building control. But my understanding is that until recently, building control have provided advice, and people have been able to go to them and say, this is our design, does it comply with building regs? And they've been willing to contribute their view. From the conversations I've had with building control people in the last few months, that's fundamentally changed.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely fundamentally changed. They are not going to do that anymore. Yep. You might argue that they never did, because they never took responsibility for it, although people perceive. I've had lots of conversations where people have said, well, it's gone through building control, therefore it must be all right. Yeah, I've had the conversation about, sorry.
So we've got circumstances. Sorry, Jim, I'll come back to you. We certainly have experience of engaging with the regulator, but it was specifically around fire-related designs. So rather than broad kind of building control kind of engagement, it was at the time the HSE was starting to get more heavily involved in the governance of fire safety design, that we were certainly able to engage with them and have those conversations about fire safety planning applications and building control applications. But has anyone else got any experience of trying to engage with the regulator about this sort of stuff?
What I was actually going to say is it did all change when we went away from prescriptive requirements to objective requirements, and we lost a huge amount of resources in the fire engineering section of fire and rescue services, where we could go into consultation. Yeah. And we also, when we privatized and I'm not getting political here, but when we went out to approved inspectors and we gave them a very narrow scope, and we lost huge amounts of the capability that we had in that segment. And then on top of that, then the building research establishment decided to go into saving the environment rather than actually look at details in buildings. So there's a whole cacophony of realizations about why we went away from what I call some real professional understanding of what was actually required. And therefore, the other thing, the last but by no means least, is this phrase on every drawing that asks for a price. It says, or equivalent. Well, or similar. I've seen or similar. Well, as soon as you see that, you can quote for anything, because you're free of any specification if you don't know what the competitors' important specifications are. So anyway, I don't mean to be too negative. I'm of an age where I remember when we did quote and we did go into consultation with all the stakeholders on a particular development, but the trust and relationships have been lost.
Okay, thanks. Jim, can I ask you, where are you from? I'm afraid I don't know.
I'm from Basildon, and the manufacturer I was involved with for 30 years was a company called J-Light, manufacturing photoluminescent escape systems, originally for the offshore oil industry, but then to do with safety way guidance systems in buildings.
Okay, all right. So very specialist then.
Well, but it actually impinges with something of everyday, like emergency lighting.
Yeah, sure.
So
Yeah.
and it goes hand in glove with emergency lighting.
Okay. No, that's good to know. And Adam, forgive me, I don't know where you're from either.
Yeah, sorry, David. I should have introduced myself. Yeah, Adam Hopkins, as probably picked up already, and I work for Peabody, so Housing Association in London.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, good to see you. Thanks. So I'm not aware. Oh, hang on. I'm certainly aware that Pete's put his hand up, so we'll go with Pete next.
Hi, David. Thank you. So for those that don't know me, I'm Pete Payton. I'm the head of Strategic Building Safety L&Q. So like Ed, I look at the back end, and like Adam, I look at the front end. So I'm a bit of a double pantomime horse at the moment. I had the luxury of taking part in some of the building control related sessions with Neil Collins Hope and Colin Blatchford Brown when they were doing them. I think Adam recognised Adam's face, he was there as well. And I enjoyed your article in LinkedIn, Adam, so thanks for speaking out. The phrase, I know this will resonate with a few of you, that was drummed into the audience during the building control sessions, where that the need is to demonstrate how the application will meet the functional requirements of the building regs, full stop. And and given the remark that was made earlier, the building control professional will now no longer give design advice. And I've been about long enough to be having the conversations with the building control officer on site, and you have the chat where, well, we're thinking of doing this, we might do that. What's your feeling about it? What are you comfortable with? And you would often get a steer as to what they're comfortable with, and you would go down that route with a degree of confidence, despite the caveat that you'd be doing the right thing. It's my interpretation of the discussions that have taken place so far with the regulator have been that advice will no longer be given, and in the operational guidance that would be an infringement to do that if you're a building control professional giving design advice, because the message I understood was don't do it. I'm the same as everyone else in this room, which is we're trying to get to the position of what do we need to do to get a successful application across the table so that work can commence to build a new HRB or do work in existing HRB. So I was and read that with interest, Adam, about the shift. I didn't make it to the call because I was applicant number 501 for the tickets, and wow, they stop it at 500. Wow. So that's the threshold, and so the only way you'll get to listen to it is if you retrospectively register for a video on demand, and you can then take from that. I don't mean to misquote Neil Hope Collins, but he's made it really clear that you need to follow the regulations. That's what you must follow, because they're now shifting from an advice and collaborative approach to soon an enforcement approach. Oh, there's nothing I'm saying here that's new to you guys. No. The tricky bit for us all is trying to work out what level of granularity do we need to go into at an application stage to be successful. Some of the clarification I got through those sessions in August was that you do not need to put a complete end-to-end completed design package at that submission to the minutiae of the detail. You do not need to do that. That was the discussions early doors, and that sort of shifted. There was discussions around phase completions and sectional completions, and that also became a bit more relaxed. The pragmatic understanding I took away from it was in your application where there were holes in your design because you haven't appointed that specialist designer yet, then that should be declared in your application. And as part of that, you should also declare at which point in your programme will you then submit that piece of design information in order that the building control can consider that. So you can have gaps in it, but you need to be clear when you're going to fill those gaps and give them that. And stating the obvious again, you cannot commence that piece of work that you do not have that approval for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how that translates into real life is a real conundrum given the real life that we've worked in. But I get it that trying to define a product so late in the process and getting into a stage where doing a wall detail when you've reached the 10th floor, that's the stuff we need to be moving away from, guys. And I don't think, sorry, that's guys in a non-gender specific way there, folks. It's an old habit of mine. But it would be impractical to think for a moment we could design everything in the initial application. It's not possible, but there's latitude there for you to do that. And that's the message I got. I've not seen and heard the real words, Adam, as to what level of relaxation are they giving us now. I'm not sure. But we've got to strike the balance between avoiding getting to the stage where a damper that's required cannot fit into the hole that's been left for the specialist subcontractor to do it. And that the sense in that is nobody wants to get there, and you want to have those sort of level things sorted out before you're cracking on with a, well before you've appointed. Does that mean that you might have to get specialist design advice prior to that? Do you know what? It very much might, which I know spits in the face of the procurement arrangements that we're all trying to work to, and that fun guidance which says or equivalent. That's the reason that's there is to protect. My interpretation is to protect the designer and also from the procurement regs, so that you can go out and procure fairly and not be accused of cutting across the procurement regs because you've specified a product. But of course, as we all know,
Hi,
and I know it's recording, you can. Hi Neil, how you doing? As long as you can put the details together of the performance of that product. Yeah, no bother, Neil. Phone you back later. No, he's gone. He's gone.
Was that a gentle persuasion to stop talking, Pete? Do you think?
I think so. Yeah, well, get him off. Yeah. So I don't have any real answers, but I think what we're trying to chase here is striking the balance for how much level of detail can you go with in order to get across the table. And the answer is unfortunately has been left in our hands because the regulator will not tell us what level of detail is acceptable.
And
there might be some mileage.
They'll tell us when we've got it wrong, probably.
Correct. Or what they'll likely say is there's insufficient information has been provided for us to consider this application. You can have it back. I think that's more likely to be the outcome.
So I get the sense that one, at the moment there are no precedents. So my understanding is that there has not yet been a Gateway 2 submission that's been made to the regulator. I might have out of date information, but I'm not aware of anyone yet that has submitted. So there's no.
We've certainly not submitted, David, and I'm not aware of any other registered providers that have done. The difficulty is the guy that wrote the policy, Colin Blatchford Brown, no longer works for the building safety regulator. So he's now an independent consultant. So the go-to person that we would speak to would be Colin. Perhaps there might be mileage there in inviting Colin to come and talk to us. He might be up for doing that. I've not discussed it with him, but he might find himself speaking more broadly.
Interesting thought.
Than he perhaps would have been when he was employed by the building safety regulator.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks, Peter. That's really helpful. Richard.
Yeah, sorry, it's something I should have said at the beginning. Please use the chat. Don't wait to get a word to speak. And as David said, we do High Points notes, which you'll be getting a copy of next week, and they include everything in the chat. So if you're a bit shy to talk, just put your comments on the chat. Nothing will be missed.
Okay,
that was it.
So before we get on to the reason why I wanted to have this conversation before we start talking about procurement is because, this topic does start to then inform a conversation about, well, when do we need to start getting people involved in the design process? When do we need the specialists involved? How do we make sure that through the procurement process, the right people are involved at the right stage? But it seems to me like we're still caught in a position of ambiguity where on the one end we've got a regulator that's saying you just need to give us enough information in order to evidence compliance with building regulations. But intuitively, most of us around the room know that in order to minimize some of the risks that happen during construction, you need to have made some of these design decisions far earlier in the process. So, you know, to what extent is this going to be led by tier one contractors, clients who are saying, you know, yeah, we won't ignore the building regulation stuff, but actually we need a process here to try and de-risk the construction process as best we can. But before we move on, has anyone got any further comments on any of this? Any other sage insights?
I'd like to ask Peter a question just for a second. So what you were saying there about selecting products later in the process, my understanding is that when you select the product, that also has got to be accepted or approved. Is that right?
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah. So let's say, for example, we were talking about dampers earlier, smoke dampers, for example. So if you don't select your smoke dampers at an early time, you could end up in a 6 to 8 week delay whilst those are being approved. Is that right?
Correct. But equally, and I'm stating the obvious, folks. So your programme won't just include construction activities, it will include in-trim building control application information going in. So you'll hopefully have a 6 week gap for that will happen early enough in the programme before you're at the stage of commit, you know, where it becomes vital, that it doesn't affect your end programme, allowing, of course, the potential for them, the building control coming back to you and saying, no, we need a bit more information on that. You've not suitably demonstrated that how that achieves the functional requirement.
Could I play devil's advocate to that, and just maybe push back slightly? So if I've made a building control application that's got an internal compartment wall that is a fire resisting wall that needs a fire damper in it. If I've submitted a design that says that wall has got 1 hour fire resistance, there is a duct going through that wall, therefore that wall needs a 1 hour fire damper. So we will install a 1 hour fire damper. How far do I have to specify what that 1 hour fire damper is in order to be able to evidence to the regulator that my design meets the fire? So what I'm saying is, if you haven't got to be specific at building regulations, the fact that you might choose a different component 6 months into construction, well, you haven't even declared a component at Gateway 2. So at the point that you select a component 6 months later, that in itself doesn't represent a change unless you've changed a 1 hour damper to a 30-minute damper.
Sure, that's right. But in my understanding, David, is that you're detailing the functional requirements of the component. You don't necessarily need to say
specify
it is brand X, model number Y. That you know you'll be, as part of your design brief, you'll be expecting the damper to deal with a particular set of environmental situations, and that's what you're you'll be generalizing, and it's connected as part of this, and any final design detail will be fed back. Now, if you make a material change from that product, like the situation you've mentioned, and it changes the argument upon which you based your functional application advice in, then that becomes a material change because it affects your original. You know, let's say you might change. Oh, wait a minute, there's going to be a change in purpose group between that. So my 60 minutes, my 60 minutes needs to become 120. And then, oh, right, okay, then work must stop. If work has even commenced on that piece, and then you need to go back and get that element of it reapproved, allowing a 6 week bit for it. So
okay.
And then there's the balance, because if you're then too specific with product and component, and then you want to deviate, then you may have to inform, or if it's a significant change in performance that can affect your argument, as I said, with your initial application, that then becomes a notifiable and a stop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So, sorry. Any other thoughts? John, welcome. You're on mute, by the way.
So yeah, I'm John Hassel, representing Waits and SES. So on the tier 1 side, yeah, and very interesting because obviously the risks involved with proceeding further without having some level of specialist input just kind of grows and grows depending on the stage where that input comes in. And what we're finding, what's interesting, is that discussion about the end of REBA 3 and into REBA 4, and the type of specialist input that you may need to de-risk the program and de-risk the projects. The damper one's a great example, because having a feasible generic design to move on with will have looked at, to some extent, the dampers that are on the market and that have tested details for fire stopping in different situations, and that actually they could physically fit in the space. So when you have that level of specialist input not there, and there may not be consideration for the space around a damper and the other services as we go through, then you can have massive changes as you go to the next stage, and all of a sudden the space doesn't work, the builder's work opening isn't big enough through the concrete, and the corridor isn't big enough. So there's this knock-on effect that you might end up having elements that were fine to pass through the gateway that are going to be impacted later on, because actually now you've had to change it, not because the design has fundamentally changed, but the level of coordination has changed, and now you've got a fundamentally different route that it's taken. And it's something that we do. I know one of the questions regarding early engagement, and we're probably lucky really, and I'm with SES, so the MEP side, and we get engaged quite early with Waits on projects to and give access to the different people that we work with, and our critical friends that they're called, who can get called on for advice at earlier stages, which is quite useful. And again, it's like knowledge silos and flagging things early enough that they can get rectified before the design, goes down the route of it being technically fixed in place without having any of that specialist input.
Thanks, John. I mean, it's an interesting segue into the procurement conversation, but before I might pick on you, John, I'm sorry, but anyone got any closing comments before we move on? And no is okay.
Hi David, it's Pete again. Sorry.
That's right.
I was kind of hoping that our contract model, colleagues, the NEC guys or the GTC guys would have come up with something that gave us a bit of latitude within the contract arrangement, and that the procurement folks gave us some latitude either to allow for this sort of scenario, because we may have designer A coming in to give us early specialist advice, and then designer B on that sub-element designing the finesse of it, and then making sure that is installed in accordance. And then we might have to cater for a difference of opinion from the original designer and then the final designer, and that's a good thing. So no answers there, David, just the same conundrums that are going on in your head as well.
And I guess that's why the Safety Act has put in play the change control process, hasn't it? I mean, it's there for that purpose. So it's not saying you can't make change. It's just saying under these circumstances you need to come and talk to us again, which I guess is what it's trying to do. Okay, time is moving along, and this was a precursor to a conversation about procurement, and I'm I'm afraid I'm going to call on John, who I know. So John, do you work for Waits or do you work with Waits? Sorry.
So I work for SES, which
Okay.
is the MEP MEP arm, MEP specialists in the Waits group.
Okay.
So Waits Construction, and we are SES supporting Waits on projects. We also work directly with other main contractors as well.
Okay. So one of the a lot of the people on the call are either clients or they're developers. So they'll be thinking about how they go about procuring their tier one suppliers, particularly. But I just wanted to explore the notion of specialist designers getting involved earlier in the process, and I was made aware that Waits have already made some decisions and have changed part of their process in order to try and include specialists earlier in the design process. And I wondered if you could give us a bit more of the thinking behind that and what's kind of prompted that decision.
Yeah, so probably is leading on to what lots of people have said. There's this element of risk that increases the further down the path you get, with the potential that you pass through REBA 3 into REBA 4, and then you have to drastically change what's there. You know, partly with the fact that the spatial checks need to be in place. It needs to be feasible, and to ensure that it's feasible, there's a certain level of input that's needed, especially around passive fire protection and fire safety that we've mentioned.
Yeah.
And that can have a impact at what would be, you know, the very early planning stages of the mass spaces that you're dealing with. So there's an element of de-risking that we want to see, and we've got the ability to call on, this is from Waits, can call on SES, who have then access to their specialists who are on a framework agreement, so can provide guidance at an early stage. And again, it's around de-risking the potential problems that are going to come later in the day. And there's a series of internal checks that we would need to go through to go from you know, prior to any construction starting, and that's quite detailed, and going to a model now where Waits Construction would have had Waits Building Services dealing with the MEP side of things. It's moving towards an SES partnership, and it just brings a level of kind of technical expertise, and it's trying to, like lots of companies, there's lots of experience with people who are spread out in various silos, and so the intention is that we kind of make it easier for the information to flow, use lessons learned in a better and more efficient way, and make those judgments about procurement, about who needs to get brought on based on the risks that we've experienced previously.
Okay. And it feels like most of Waits' supply chain is already in place. I suspect there are a list of specialists that you can call on, but that supply chain is established.
That's correct, yeah.
So is that, so in a design and build environment, is that extending your design period before you start construction? So where I'm trying to get to here is how does that change in approach? How does that impact upon the way in which Waits as a tier one supplier need to be procured? And fundamentally, this is kind of coming to a, you know, in a design and build world, you know, does single stage tendering still work, or is two-stage tendering a better approach to take? So I'm trying to look at it from a contractor's perspective before we look at it from a client perspective. So I'm just interested in your views about how this new approach influences the best way to procure Waits and their services.
Yeah, and I mean, earlier gives you that better chance of steering and keeping to the same kind of durations that you'd have had. So the idea is that you make the initial design stages more robust by giving very pointed information, very specific information for key elements. That means that at the end of that stage, there's less activity to pick up and rectify. So it's not a case of extending the overall design period. But the reality will be that, and a lot of the time, is that merging of design and construction periods. And, you know, we talked about that hard stop of it's designed and then it's built. Partly what we're wanting to do is to reduce the overlap between the design and construction where feasible. And obviously you can have phased installation, which might not be impacted by ongoing design. But the idea is that you have a clear, you've clearly run through the design, you've gone down the route of, in lots of the cases we're digitizing it, we'll go looking at the digital twin side of things. So it's just releasing as much of the benefits as you can from the technology of it as well. That means that as you start pouring concrete, you can be validating that in real time versus the MEP design. So you overall, I suppose there's the chance that design stages may start coming a bit longer, but the reality will be that that's the overlap is reducing.
Yeah. Okay. Just before I bring you in, George, I've just got a follow-on question. So, by involving your specialists earlier, you're creating more design certainty earlier. But looking at it from a cost management point of view, at the point a client is asking you to give them a fixed price, the earlier that you employ a specialist, the longer the time period between that specialist giving you design advice and actually having to do an installation. So from a risk point of view, if you're a specialist subcontractor, to what extent are you trying to get them to fix their prices maybe 6 months, even to a year, before they're going to be on site actually fitting something onto a building? Because the longer that gap, the more potentially the more commercial risk there is that needs to flow up the chain, so to speak. I'm not sure that's a particularly coherent question, but I'm just trying to understand the commercial dynamic, if you like, and to what extent that changes by involving manufacturers and specialists earlier in the process.
Yeah, you're right. You've got the risk that and the kind of probably near certainty that the conditions will change if you have a extended period of time between the two.
Yeah.
And really it's targeting what information do you need early, and it's not a case of engaging every specialist on a project ahead of time.
Yeah, sure.
And a lot of it may be information that's brought through, and it's guiding and giving advice to people that are already engaged with, who are not the specialists, but actually a level of advice to mean that you get to a point earlier that the fixed price can be fixed with an element of inflation in there, and market conditions.
Okay. Sorry, just one final. From a weights point of view, what is their preferred means of being procured by clients? So would they prefer a single stage or a two stage, and is that view changing as a consequence of the new approach?
Yeah, I'd probably need to defer that.
You're going to plead the Fourth Amendment, yeah?
I'm going to have to. Yeah, I will have to.
That's okay. I understand.
Yeah, it is not something that I'd probably be able to give a good answer to.
Yeah. And it was an unfair question, I guess, but it was just trying to provide a segue into a conversation about single versus two stage. George, you've sat there very patiently with your hand up.
Yeah, it was just building on what you said, actually, David, and that is I've been involved in this whole area of collaborative working and bringing people in earlier in the process for probably 20 years.
Yeah.
And in fact, we developed a new contract with the government called Integrated Project Insurance, where nobody on the scheme had any PI. The project has the PI, and everybody is procured not on the basis of cost. They're based on the basis of quality, and therefore they're actually appointed, and therefore they can work collaboratively earlier in the process to make sure the design is right before the prices are fixed.
Mhm.
Now, that's obviously, I mean, that process has won awards, but it's obviously a huge step away from where we are in the industry. So my question to you, John, is if, for example, you've got a specialist contractor in your supply chain, maybe a ductwork contractor, for example, that you might bring them in, or smoke controlled or something like that, you might bring them in to contribute their knowledge and experience to the process. Would you pay them for the time that they're spending doing that, or is that something that they're doing completely at risk, and they would give away what they might see as their good ideas, and then you would then go to an alternative supplier, and then I see Martin got his hand up there.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, George, and like was mentioned before, we've got a kind of a trusted framework of suppliers that we go to and specialists that we work with, and we probably wouldn't have that if we
If you
went down
reneged
the
on
route of that's
Yeah.
right. So, and that doesn't mean that we go away from a competitive tender process with supply chain, but that there's an understanding that we work together, and if certain projects are won or lost, that there's a balance in there. So it depends on the project, and it will depend on if it's part of a framework agreement that we've already got and that we already have people in place with on previous buildings. But the idea is that we want to be fair with the people and partners that we work with. So it really wouldn't be expected that we'd be mining information and then not using that information.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's different types of contracts that we are looking at, and hopefully we'll develop further with partners. And you mentioned the integrated project insurance, and something that would be really good to see a little bit more of in this country would be a integrated project delivery style contract where
Yes.
you're sharing the risks, but you're sharing the benefits, and everybody is working to reduce the risks in the same way that your insurance kind of contract does as well.
Good.
John, before I move on to Martin, John, I just wanted to say thank you for coming onto the call and sharing it. It's feeling a bit like the Spanish Inquisition right now, I bet, but no,
not a problem.
We're genuinely interested in what you've got to say. So, but thanks for coming on. Similarly, Martin, pleased to see you here. What have you got to say?
Yeah, afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Oates from SE Control. So those who don't know us, we're a specialist smoke ventilation company, very much in the high-rise residential market. Very interesting topic that I'm jumping in on now from John and discussions with Waits, because of course we are almost a secondary subcontractor, traditionally specialist contractor, very often sitting under MEP. But of course, hugely influential within the design of the project, as we are, designing smoke vent systems with CFD modelling and early design with fire engineers. So there are in-house fire engineers and services that we offer as a specialist subcontractor that is usually provided much further down the line. Mm-hmm. And of course, the trend moving forwards now is that skill and level of service is required earlier, pre-appointment. And that's exactly what's happening now with Waits and Pete with L&Q. We're working on a number of projects now where that early engagement is happening. And of course, it then begs the question and the challenge of, well, you're not employed, you're not guaranteed to do that work, but then the contractor or the design team require the support of that specialist business to get the design done at an earlier stage. So that is the conundrum that we now have. And how are we getting over that? Well, there is a huge element of trust, because there is a lot of financial commitment from the specialist, like ourselves. You know, our design team, our fire engineers, our BDMs are involved in these design negotiations and discussions, very much alongside the fire consultant or the M&E consultant who may be designing the project, but very often we are also requested then to validate that design, because potentially the contractual responsibility for that design may come down contractually to us. So even if there's a fire design done, we will have to potentially do it again because we may take that responsibility, or we've been asked to validate. And there's a few Waits projects at the moment where we are validating the CFD that's been done by the fire engineer. So this is the here and now, and this is certainly the trend moving forwards for us. It's much earlier engagement. It's high commitment from highly skilled design members of the team. And how do we do it? Well, framework is the answer. So the discussions we have with these businesses is, look, we can only provide this level of service to so many people with so much resource, and that is a mutual agreement with be it Waits, be it with L&Q, be it with whoever, and I suppose in a way the worm is turning in that service is required and there is only so much of it available. So it's about being strategic, putting frameworks in place. You're not necessarily guaranteed the work, but as an overall framework over a period of time, the commitment is there from both parties. And thus far, we have found that we've been able to provide that level of service and commitment, and the project will then go through design. It will then go into procurement. You're not guaranteed that work, but you get your fair share, and you get the amount of work that you are happy with when you go into this discussion from day one. So we understand the specialists that purchasers need to have choice. We need to, that there's always been a reticence to bring specialists on board because I'm going to be tied to them and then they're going to pull my pants down, pardon the French. And that's got to change, because to get that early level of engagement, support and skill, it is a two-way street, that there has to be some commitment to bring specialists on in a framework, but the protection needs to be there as well so that you're not exposed. And we found there's a balance to strike, and thus far that has worked well. And of course, the day doesn't work when you do all the work and then you get sold down the river. Of course, then you move on to the next one. And that's where the trust comes, because contractors, where I say Waits, L&Q, they want that level of service, and will retain that level of service via framework agreements. And of course, as soon as they go away from that, then they will lose that support, and that support will go elsewhere.
Is this because, are you being asked to get involved during the tender stage? So in a Waits scenario, is this what Waits themselves haven't even won the contract yet? So is it part of the bidding process, or is it post Waits appointment?
Yes, we are now working within the tender process as well. Right. Yes.
Okay. All right. Yes. Neil, you've patiently had your hand, and thank you, Martin. You're welcome. That's really helpful. Neil, you had your hand up.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's my first call, so I'm virgin to this call. I'd like to obviously pass on my thanks to George for inviting us. I work for the EARS group, and we're somewhere near the sort of foot of the chain, shall we say. I think, Martin, you've covered a lot of what I was going to share. I think we probably sit at a fairly similar level in the supply chain. I think, John, it's been great to hear the way weights work. I truly mean that. I think it's collaborative. Some of the challenges we face, though, are numerous. First and foremost, basics. We work within the fire and safety compliance world. Sadly, a lot of the times people don't understand that world and they see it as a grudge purchase. So we've got to overcome why you need a fire alarm system. It doesn't generate revenue for somebody particularly, but we have to overcome that. This discussion has been about involving people at earlier stages from a design perspective. We would thoroughly endorse that. But go back to Martin's point, we have limited capacity, both within us as an organisation and also the industry full stop. I don't think many people tend to leave school thinking I'm going to go into the fire alarms and security industry. They tend to fall into it. And there's a lot of people on this call, please don't accept this as a negative, but there's a lot of people on this call with a couple of grey hairs or two. And once you fall into this industry, you don't tend to get out of it. We're stuck. We face challenges every single month with increased product costs. It's a huge challenge for us. And much as we'd like to go into those early design stages, for us to give a fixed price on the 1st of January, when we may not be on site until the 30th of December, for instance, is quite difficult to do so. Yeah. And that's a real challenge for us. We want to raise fire safety within the whole industry. And I think what we're talking about today is a construction industry. I was around I think somebody mentioned earlier on, pre-design and build, God forbid. When we did do designs in those early stages, and we were at times in those stages paid to do the design work, and for our technical expertise we were paid a fee to deliver that expertise. We're at the foot of the ladder, if you like, in many respects. From a supplier perspective, we are more often than not, I think Jimmy mentioned this earlier, we're expected to deliver our service and our expertise and our technical expertise on a free of gratis basis. And we're due to give that on the basis that possibly we may then secure the projects further down the line. And that is something we've got to overcome. And we can only overcome that by the people on this call agreeing to that process, that if you're looking for technical expertise, you've got to pay for that expertise. You just simply can't expect suppliers like SE Controls, like ourselves, to subsequently keep giving that expertise and then hoping and praying to God that our price is as competitive as it needs to be to then secure the works. So it's a huge really challenge for us at the foot of the ladder. Yeah. And I just wanted to share that. Like I say, Martin, I think you commented an awful lot about what I was going to say anyway, but I hope that's been helpful, sort of to give a perspective from people further down the food chain. It can be quite challenging.
Really good context, Neil. Thank you.
Martin, if I may just add to that and finish my point, that everything we do isn't free. That we are being engaged and employed and paid to do levels of design. Depends on what that design is. If we're using fire engineers and doing CFD models of smoke systems, of course, we do often get paid for that work. We may be engaged with a design order on a project predominantly when it's won. Of course, we generally wouldn't get a design order for a job that a contractor, for instance, is tendering for. But once that tenderer has got that project, then very often we may get a design order that locks us in to give that level of service with no guarantee you're going to get the project. So it is doable, and I think one thing that the industry needs to understand, and I think does understand nowadays, is by putting upfront cost to design, by aligning specialists to influencers such as consultants. Consultants will provide a specification based on standards, regs and design. But then when you bring a specialist aligned to that team that kind of puts meat on the bones of how you actually deliver that system as well, then yes, you may have some upfront costs to do that, but your savings further down the line, that there's always this hidden cost, isn't there, of coordination mistakes, getting things, wrong first time, and the cost of that is never understood. Whereas, of course, to do this work, and we are finding this level of work really early, but we're talking about some of the items that you mentioned there. How do you fit that damper in that opening? We've seen designs where you've got a huge fan on the top of the roof that's too high, and it's too high for planning, or it's facing the wrong direction and it's shooting smoke into the plant room. All these kind of things happen with design that doesn't involve a specialist who's got experience of these issues. And we are these issues are being ironed out now much earlier in the process, which will save. It's difficult, it's intangible, but how much money that saves in the long run, in money and time, more importantly,
it's a leap of faith, isn't it?
Is huge.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin. Jim sat there patiently.
Just coming back again on the procurement side, I totally agree with Neil and the points that Martin makes, and that is, I think that the answer is within the framework agreements, so that the framework agreement covers not only building regulations, but also the other pieces of regulations, specifically that manufactured products have to cover. So building regulations to me means sort of a catnap approach, cheapest available technique needed to avoid prosecution. And then Neil has to be concerned about the actual occupants in that building, how they behave when the fire alarm goes off, and other things, including care in the community for those people that may be infirm or envisaged to be encompassed in that HRB, and make recommendations for those. And the why I say the framework agreement, because the framework agreement for specialist contractors can actually encompass through the procurement system a whole bunch of other technical add-ons. This is the thing about, the product that I happen to be involved with, which is the application of safety communication within buildings. It's loosely called wayfinding. It could be fire and rescue deployment that is in building regulations. It could be fire door keep shut signs, which is in building regulations. But then we've got further occupational health and safety requirements that also need communicating within that building. And those solid pieces of advice is absolutely important to the design considerations of how that building is going to be occupied. The other, last but by no means least, is that competition doesn't necessarily have to have all of those technical advice situations. They just wait for a list of products that needs to be tendered from a manufacturer. The other thing that manufacturers have to contend with is working with other contractors and distributors that may add these products to their offering in order to fulfill the total legal requirements within the building. So I think, as I say, what's really positive to come out of this is the framework agreement is the mechanism to do it, engaging with specialist contractors like Neil to talk honestly about fire alarm systems, because you can't actually conform to a standard for fire alarms because they need to know what the purpose group and application and occupants of that building are going to be to consider the design. So that needs to be an open book as well. So that's where I found the meeting today very, very constructive in terms of specifically John and Waits and what Waits are doing with SES, collecting that body of a technical framework. And of course, Martin, you must be a leader in this, because be able to create that and have already the workings of a framework agreement in your own specialist contraction is fantastic for my ear. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jim. So we've only got a few minutes left. I was just going to give you a little anecdote actually from my dark potted past. So I used to work for BAA when Sir John Egan joined BAA and wrote a little book with government called Rethinking Construction. And Rethinking Construction was all about how do we get supply chains to collaborate more effectively. And I always remember I ran a workshop for a project team, and there was a cladding manufacturer there and an architect. And the cladding manufacturer said to the architect, why do you always design your cladding panels 800 wide or whatever the dimension was? I've got no idea. And the architect says, well, that's the way we've always done it. And he said, well, the problem you've got is that the steel gets delivered to my factory in a certain width. And all I really want to do is fold that steel into a dimension, because you've specified a width of panel. I have to cut it, which adds another process in my factory, which adds cost. And unless we'd got an architect together with a cladding manufacturer together in a room to talk sensibly about what adds cost and what doesn't, that information would never have come to light. And it's just interesting in a framework environment. Frameworks are fine, but you've still got to create that collaboration within them to have the real conversations, that de-risk things for the supply chain and actually deliver a better price for the client. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. So we've got about four minutes left, which isn't a huge amount of time. What I really wanted to try and tease out, and maybe we'll do this another time, but I just wanted to get a sense from the client organizations and the developer, so the guys that are procuring tier 1 suppliers, is your thinking changing around procurement? So those of us that traditionally do single stage design and build tenders, are we starting to think about moving away from that as an approach, or do we still think it's relevant? Certainly for us at Notting Hill Genesis, we're doing a lot more joint venture work than we did before, and by its nature, it's creating a more kind of collaborative, kind of upfront approach to life. So just in the last couple of minutes, does anyone want to share their thoughts about whether their procurement thoughts are changing?
I can speak for us at Peabody, or I can talk about our experiences, I should say. I won't talk on behalf of the entire organisation. I think I'm CEO yet. We watch this space. We've done we've done a lot more joint ventures over the past couple of years. I think it's fair to say, based on my understanding of kind of recent history, last 10 years or so, and they've appeared to be quite successful for the same reasons you mentioned, David, that kind of earlier collaboration. And then on projects where we aren't going down a joint venture route, which tends to be the bigger stuff for a variety of reasons, where we are doing a kind of D&B, land-led type delivery, we are finding more success, I think, if I can put it that way, in the kind of two-stage approach. I think the key consideration for us is what the scope of the contractor's involvement is at the early stage, and making sure that that words get used like control and influence, and I think it's making sure that we as a client organization are comfortable that the design at the point when that construction partner gets involved is, going back to that use of parameters, is within kind of acceptable parameters for us, and includes all the things that we want and need. And then the contractors coming in and adding that kind of extra layer of detail and bringing their specialism and just fleshing that out, and doing that in a way that mitigates risk by getting it all packaged up before we eventually, ideally negotiate and go into a contract and make building control or building control applications, as it will soon be.
Okay. So my take on that is there seems to be a movement towards a two-stage approach that seems to develop a better result for you guys right now.
It does, and we've spoken to a number of our contractors recently, and I won't mention names, but it's all kind of people you would be familiar with.
Yeah, sure.
And perhaps unsurprisingly, they're all saying, you know, we want to work with you earlier, and you know, there's obvious benefits to that. And you know, no one fell off their chair in the meeting room when that got said. But we were interested in the timing and the manner in which that engagement happened. And when we asked the question, you know, what time do you think would work for you, particularly in the context of the new regulator and gateways and building control procedures, they were saying, well, really, you know, once you've finished REBA 3, that's when we need to be in then. That's when we want to start helping you and making decisions. If you bring us in too late, so maybe you do a kind of 4A as we refer to it. I think people tend to carve out REBA into kind of A, Bs and Cs and pluses and minuses. They said you could do it later, but then you're risking that we might actually need to go kind of one step back to go 2 forward. So you got to weigh up the risk of that. I think we're not wedded to any particular route yet, and we're kind of in a very flexible place, and we're trying to work out what is best for us. So there's no hard and fast rules yet, as I say, and I'm definitely not speaking on behalf of Peabody, but those are the kind of things we're considering, and we're kind of, you know, as I say, we're talking to our supply chain to understand what's going to work for them and how we can be a kind of good and I suppose appealing client to work for. So when a tender goes out, people go, oh yeah, that's a Peabody job, we like working with them because we make money, you know, and those jobs go well, which is we've got to think of as a client, I think.
No, spot on. Adam, thank you for sharing. Again, we've just gone a minute over time. I just want to close things out, but before I do, has anyone got anything that they'd like to share before I shut the meeting down? And anything burning in people's minds? Okay. I hope that that's been an interesting and a useful discussion. We maybe didn't get as close to some of the specifics about how we might go about doing things differently going forwards, but I don't think that's a surprise, because I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer. Right now, there's just better answers, I think, for different parts of the supply chain. I hope everyone's found that useful. We hold these sessions every couple of months, George. Does that feel about right? It's about every couple of months, isn't it? I ought to know.
Yeah, each working group meets every 2 months.
There you go.
Right,
that'll do it.
So that means we've got 12 a year. So there's 1 a month. The development group meets every other month, but next week I think we've got the operations group. So
yeah. What I'd encourage you. One, it's great to see so many of you on the call, and I'm glad it's generated some interest. If there are issues, topics, questions that you would like to see kind of discussed in this sort of environment, which hopefully is pretty informal and helpful, then please let us know. So either to George or to Richard Freer is here, or myself, please just email us, and we'll try and shape future sessions to suit the things that you'd like to discuss and talk about. So I will draw it to a close now. I've run over a couple of minutes, but lovely to see you all. Thank you for your input. We'll produce some notes and we'll get those circulated around. Good to see you all. Take care.
Brilliant, David. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Guys.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Thank you, David. Cheers now.
Cheers.
No problem. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you all.